Australia is poaching our ECE teachers. I have two clips to play. One is of David Seymour, who has some responsibility in this area, but this first clip is only about 60 seconds, 61 to be precise, and it's an ECE teacher, Ken Horney, I think it is, and he's just moved to Australia, and he shared with Breakfast this morning why he had moved.
ECE teacher Ken Ahone moved to Victoria from Porirua just 3 weeks ago. He's got up very early on the other side of the Tasman to speak to us. Ken, thanks so much for your time this morning. What was the final straw that made you move?
So I've been a teacher for 10 years and graduated with my degree in teaching ECE. It was the cost of living. Like, I wasn't able to live independently, on my own. So I had to move back with my parents. It's just not something I wanted to do. Then an opportunity opened up, and it was through the Victorian incentive. So they were, offering money, and I decided to take it.
Was the draw card the money?
Yeah, pretty much money and just some of the working conditions.
So it's lovely, eh? Because I know I'm being silly here, but if you pay teachers $1 million a year, they wouldn't go anywhere, and you would have the cream of the crop from the rest of the world trying to get here. If you pay them $1 a year, they'd all leave. And the question is, where is that balance that doesn't stop them continuing to go to Australia? And it seems we did this last night, actually talking about the police, Jeremy, and what the police have been offered. That $800 million gap, right? That $800 million gap in National's plan for interest deductibilities. $800 million mistake, $800 million error. With that $800 million, if you chose to, you could offer every police officer in New Zealand an additional $76,000. Now, I'm not suggesting you would offer everything, but I'm saying how easily and simply a decision to funnel funds this way is versus funneling funds that way. $800 million hole, what could that have been done with? Teachers, nurses, and of course, police officers.
I remember the first time I heard the ad. Some people who watch it or know me at all will realize I'm a big baseball fan, and I was listening to an American baseball podcast, and I heard the ad for the Victorian relocation fund for specifically for teachers.
So it was an American broadcast.
Well, it's a podcast, but it is it's very much aimed at American market. And they were advertising, hey, g'day, come and live in Victoria. The weather's good, and you can do this and you can do that. Plus, we'll pay your relocation. And I just remember hearing it and thinking, I've heard stories about that happening, about how Australia helped fast track visas when they reopened after COVID to get hospitality, for example, workers into the country more easily, whereas we were still throwing up all kinds of barriers. Australia does a lot of things that I don't like, but that particular thing, you can see why people are moving. Of course they are. I mean, one of the barriers that stops someone moving, we've known for decades that wages are generally higher in Australia. But one of the things that stops people moving is it costs quite a lot of money to get there.
Yeah.
Well, if they're throwing $50,000 at you, I think somebody said, as a relocation,
I think it's up to $50,000 relocation cost. So basically, if you spend $35,000, I think they're giving you $35,000 for relocation. Right,
but it's up to 50. So that's all your flights, including your pets, if you're taking pets, because that's not cheap. Yep. Shipping your furniture, it's tough to compete with, but it doesn't feel like we're even trying to compete with it at the moment. I think that's actually where you're heading with a couple of things that David Seymour had to say about it. There's almost a feeling of like we think it doesn't, or certain people think it doesn't really matter. It does, when you're losing, that's generational. If you're losing the top tier of educators, in the same way, and it doesn't have to be ECE, it doesn't have to be school, it could be, it's the same thing that's been happening at universities. When the top lecturers in health departments, economics, law departments are taking plum jobs overseas and not teaching here, it diminishes an entire generation. We're not talking about the number of jobs, which is high enough in itself, but we're talking about the generation of people who are missing out on their education afterwards.
So David Seymour also this morning was talking about this. He was interviewed on Breakfast, and look, we've said this before about Mr. Luxon. I've looked for the clip, I can't find it, but I well remember Mr. Luxon being on a breakfast show talking about nurses actually, and him talking about this terrible Labor government and all of the nurses that are going to Australia and they're earning more. And so, of course, the interviewer, as they should, said, so you're going to pay them more as Prime Minister. And he would not commit to it. So he complained and complained and complained and complained about Labor, losing nurses, better money. So you're going to fix it by paying them more money. Stum. Would not answer that. We do get a little bit of the same vibe with Mr. Seymour here. In fact, I've cut out a bunch of this conversation because he does go through a whole 2 minutes of blame Labor, blame Labor, blame Labor. And then, of course, he asked the question himself, you're going to ask us what we're doing. And that's how we start this part of the clip.
But your question is, what are you going to do about it?
Yes, well, I'm hearing you don't think that we maybe don't need to, would be the implication.
I should explain this. David Seymour made it pretty clear that, well, it sounded like he was making it clear that because the number of ECE teachers had actually gone up by 3% last year due to immigration. And so what Anna Burns-Francis is saying is it sounds like you don't think it's a big deal because you're already saying because of immigration, the number of ECE teachers is up. Is that what you're saying? So that was with her, just referencing her saying, it sounds like you.
If the numbers are increasing, you think the situation is not dire or is not as bad as it's being made out to be?
No, I think it's important that a conversation like this starts with facts, and I've just given you the really basic ones. But nonetheless,
patronising much, just between me and you, patronising much.
The idea that there is low morale and that people are very frustrated in the sector is true. In the time that I've been involved, and that includes before I was the Minister, visiting centres and talking to people that operate them and parents that send their kids there, I'd say that there's a few things going on. One is money. We put about $2.7 billion of taxpayer money into ECE each year, and we'll increase that in this budget.
I know, all we get is some of the most expensive childcare in the entire world, right?
So there is significant taxpayer money going in there, and it will increase at this budget. The second thing is the enormous inflexibility around the funding formula. So you've just heard the NZ ECE say that they want pay parity.
So this is what these guys do, yeah? He's basically saying it's a problem to get pay parity. And what he's going to go on to say is because then less qualified teachers from overseas will get paid because they've been teachers for 7 years than a more qualified New Zealand teacher in their second year. Now, you can fix that, Mr. Seymour, Cluxon, by simply paying the teachers more who are on the 2-year spot. It's an easy fix, but what this government seems to be doing, Jeremy, is putting in roadblocks along the way of logic which can easily be remedied, but they're choosing not to remedy it. You know what I mean?
Well, it's doing exactly what it did in our earlier conversation about labour laws. Is it muddies the water by throwing the blame on existing problems within the system, existing problems within the law, within the wording of the law, within the red tape involved in various laws. And those problems might exist, but the fundamental problem is, go back to that first interview, that first interview, you had a guy who had trained as a teacher, started working as a teacher, and had to move back in with his parents. That's the problem.
Yep. And we heard last night.
He didn't move because
some police are moving back in with their parents. Police.
He didn't move to Australia because he was. I can't remember quite what David Seymour just said, that he was fed up or that morale was low. He obviously loves his job. He's moved to another country to do the same job.
Yeah.
But he couldn't afford to live independently, was his words. And that's. And, let me be clear at this. I don't think any of our last governments have done enough to address this issue. I mean, I don't think this is not something that's new to this government. But what he's doing in this interview is, like you said, and like we alluded to in the conversation around workers' contracts and health and safety and things like that, is that they're shifting the blame. They're putting the blame on the paperwork as opposed to the bottom line. For a government that seems very insistent on the bottom line, improving the bottom line for businesses, they don't seem to be showing a lot of that for improving the bottom line for anybody else.
Yeah. And just so you know, Jeremy, one of the things we've been doing for this whole political season is we're judging this current government by what they held Labor accountable for when they were in opposition.
So I think
I think it's really fair. I mean, at minimum, we want to hold this government accountable to what they attempted to hold Labor accountable to, and we want to hold them accountable to what they've said. Now, so I agree with you. This is a systemic problem that's gone on for decades. Teachers are not getting paid enough.
Yeah.
But these guys came out and basically said, we're going to solve this, and they're not. So even though this is a systemic problem over decades, these guys we are at least going to hold them to the words they talked about. They criticised Labor for exactly what they're doing right now and not providing solutions to. So therefore, don't criticise Labor or fucking fix the problem. Okay?
And I didn't realize you were doing that, but of course you are, because you have to, because they didn't run on anything else.
Yeah.
You know, their election was not about having 50 great new ideas that they wanted to try. In some ways, the last two Labor victories were run on ideas, and my disappointment is that a lot of those ideas never went anywhere, or were not followed through, or they quite frankly chickened out on some of them. So holding this government to account for the stuff that they have been criticizing for the last 6 years is perfectly fair and valid. And I acknowledge your right to do so.
All right, so let's get. This has been a long setup and interruption of Mr. Seymour, but this is. I just wanted to highlight. This is what he's doing, right? He's about to say pay parity is not going to work because that wouldn't be fair to the younger teachers who are New Zealand trained. And as I said, there's an easy fix: pay those teachers more, and then it's fine.
But let's just be clear what that means. It means an inflexible scale of union negotiated payments for every single worker in the sector. And where the people operating the centres end up is they get a certain amount of money per hour per kid from the parents and from the government, and then they have to pay these rates. And it sometimes doesn't make a lot of sense.
But you haven't got pay parity at the moment, and you've got a problem. So why not do pay parity and maybe don't have a problem?
Well, because it already, where it applies, in order to have pay parity, in order to get extra funding, you have to apply it. So, where it applies, it actually is inflexible, and it creates very strange incentives. For example, you'll see centres where somebody who's not that experienced, who's coming from overseas, one of those people we were talking about earlier, actually ends up getting paid more than somebody who is at a lower pay grade but from New Zealand and is actually more useful in the centre. So
there's a couple of things there about the xenophobia there, that the person from overseas, the New Zealand born one, will be better for the thing. Who knows? But that's the example of it. So they're putting a roadblock in place, but legislation could easily fix whatever that roadblock is, if it is or isn't accurate. They could sort that out with a stroke of a pen if they wanted to.
The other thing, sorry, Pat. The other thing that he's, I got a little confused there, but he's talking about funding for centres, for schools and centres, and he's saying that so he's saying with pay parity that's the only way they get funding. So change the funding model.
Yeah,
change the funding model to simply put more money in, and it gets spread amongst the teachers.
Yeah. Easy, simple. So there's a solution. So they're saying this is the problem why it won't work now. What they're not saying is we have got the ways that we can change it and fix that. They're just staying at the problem. And we might even get to that in a story coming up before we finish tonight. We're talking about rates and how expensive they are. There is ways to fix that, but rates hasn't been sorted out for decades, and so now we're facing a problem. These guys are saying there's a problem that's been here for a long time, and then they're stopping. So fix the problem. You can fix the problem. It just requires more money. That $800 million mistake you made, that millions or hundreds of millions given back to landlords, all that stuff, all of that stuff could solve this problem, but you're making an active decision to do that rather than fix this. Don't hide from it like this. If they were honest about it, I would respect them more. If they were like, no, we've given the money there, so we can't do it here, I'd be like, you're pricks, but I respect you as the prickishness that you are. But they're basically going, like last night, Mark Mitchell said over and over again that the tax breaks to the landlords, that's a completely different conversation than how we're paying police. No, it's not, because it's money going into a pot and it's money coming out of it. They're not being honest. Be honest, and I would respect you more. That's what I think. Anyway. We'll keep going.
Because when we started off this conversation, you talked about the numbers going up, and that is largely reliant on migration. That's not New Zealand graduates, and yet we are seeing New Zealand graduates go overseas. These are Kiwis leaving our country and being replaced by foreign workers coming in to fill the gap.
This is my point. But
is that actually a problem?
Well, here's the point. What pay parity means, if you think it's a problem, then pay parity means that you have to pay somebody who is a New Zealander, recently graduated, less than someone who is from overseas, maybe actually less New Zealand experience and less useful to the kids in that centre at that time.
I mean, the question that I'd like to ask him is, why would you say that an international teacher, ECE, is less useful? It's just a strange turn of phrase to say that they're less useful. What? Well, they might be, but they might actually be more useful. It's just such a bland statement that kind of feels a bit, as I said before, it's got the feeling of dog whistling xenophobia to me. Like they're those foreigners who aren't as useful.
And again, it's avoiding the fundamental question, which is, well, then pay the recently graduated, raise the floor. Raise the floor on all of this. You can have both. You can have pay parity. You just raise the floor that it's starting from.
Yeah. All right.
So if you want to put this inflexible model right across the system, I just tell you that's one of the consequences of what the union are asking for.
You could alter the pay parity scheme, though. I mean, the union can ask for one thing and you can apply something else. At the end of the day, the union is actually also just asking for more money. People like Ken are saying we need to be paid more. The salary difference, I think it's $50,000 starting wage in New Zealand. It's $80,000 in Australia. I mean, it's $30,000.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's not too far off the difference in the average wage between the two countries. I mean, we got to wake up and...
and that's bullshit, because the average wage here is between $90,000 and $100,000, right? So if he's trying to say 50, somewhere around 50 is the average wage, and the average wage in Australia is not 120. So,
I see what you mean. Yeah, right. Okay. Yep. Sorry.
So I think I don't think he's got that right at all.
Face that reality.
That we're always going to have lower wages than them anyway.
No, that's a pessimistic.
Actually, that response requires normal speed. We're going to go back for that. The face that he pulled for that when Anna Burns-Francis took the logical leap to say, so you're saying the gap's about the same, therefore you're saying we'll always have lesser, almost like she offended him, like she said something bad about his mother.
This is a total distraction, but I keep thinking she's got her arm in a cast. I just keep feeling sorry for her. I keep thinking she's got a broken arm. Anyway, carry on.
It's a sponsored cast.
I know, it's the laptop. It's the laptop. Yeah,
there we go.
$1,000 in Australia. I mean, it's $30,000.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's not too far off the difference in the average wage between the two countries. I mean, we got to wake up and face that.
No, I mean, I'm not actually playing him slower than he normally talks now. You're just used to 1.25.
Reality.
That we're always going to have lower wages than them anyway.
No, that's a pessimistic prognostication, Anna.
No, I'm just saying you just said we had to face reality. What is the reality?
The reality is that the statistics are that today. The reality is we've had successive governments that have not focused on productivity, have not focused on getting more homes built, which is part of that guy's problem and why he left. He had to live with his parents, you notice. And as a result, it's attractive for people to leave New Zealand. We need to fix productivity. We need to fix over-regulation. We need to fix housing. If we don't do those things as a government, I suspect that people will lose confidence in us. And if we don't do those things as a country, I suspect that more and more young people will lose confidence in us.
Finally,
talking points.
Everything you've just said, valid points. None of it was what they're asking for, which is more money. Will you give the sector more money?
Well, if you recall the start of the interview just 3 minutes ago, I said that there will be an increase in this year's budget. So it's actually yes. But the other thing,
for them to stop saying they need more money.
I think that would be the first time in the history of any budgeting process. But here's the other thing we're going to do. We're also going to reduce the crazy amounts of rules that take up people's time and make it harder to work and run in a centre.
We will run that conversation another day.
Here's an example.
I appreciate it. There is a whole argument around regulation, but we are talking on pay today. So David Seymour, thank you so much for coming in this
I'm sorry,
morning.
the regulation that makes it harder to run is one of the major frustrations.
Sure, but that is an entirely different...
Talking points. So we're going to remove all regulations, and then I'm sure all early childhood centres will run so much better with no regulations. I'm sure there'll be no ill effects from that, Jeremy.
He made one point. I'm going to put my hand up here and say he made one point that I agree with, which is he did say that if they don't do anything about it, people will lose confidence in them. And I'm taking that as them being his party and his government. And hopefully he's right. Because, like you say, you can hit all these talking points, but you've never got to what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do differently? I'm the first to say I don't think things have been done perfectly for the last, decade or more. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to change?
And unfortunately, sometimes, and look, Anna Burns-Francis has been on fire this week. Like what she did with Christopher Luxon the other day, everyone in the chat agrees was just masterful, And she wasn't even necessarily masterful. She just led him down a logical trap, and he looked like a complete buffoon. But you can still say what you could do more is because he got away from a question there, and she didn't go back, which was, are you going to pay them more? And he said we are putting more money into ECE in the budget. So yes. So what does that mean? $1 more per person? Like now, what is that more going to turn into for actual the ECE teachers day to day? How much more will they get? So we didn't quite get there, but this is the negative of TV, and the positive of things like this is they've got 7 minutes to get to the next ad break, and then off they got to go.